Started. Good afternoon. This is Transportation Committee Chair Deb Barber. It is Monday, February 22nd, 2021. Before I call this meeting to order, I'd like to say a few things about how we will conduct this meeting. I want to acknowledge that COVID-19 is calling all of us to alter our usual procedures. As we know, Governor Walz has declared a peacetime emergency in response to COVID-19, and the Met Council has determined it's not practical or prudent to conduct an in-person committee meeting for the reasons stated in the governor's emergency executive order. Accordingly, Met Council members will participate in this meeting by phone or other electronic means, and this Transportation Committee meeting will be conducted under Minnesota Statute 13D.021. Because we are conducting the meeting electronically, all votes must be taken by roll call. Before we start the meeting, we need to establish whether there is a quorum. With that, Jenna, could you call the roll, please?
Chambliss, Cummings, Ferguson,
Here.
Fredson,
Here.
Gonzalez,
Here.
Sterner, Zarin, Barber.
Here. Having a quorum present, I call to order the meeting of the Metropolitan Council Transportation Committee for February 22nd, 2021. Our first order of business is approval of the agenda. If there are no changes or additions to the agenda, we can just proceed. Seeing none, we'll go with that. Our agenda is approved. Next is approval of the minutes. We need to approve the minutes from the February 8th, 2021 meeting. Does anyone have any changes or additions?
Nope.
Not. I entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
Councilmember Fredson will move approval.
It's moved by Fredson. Is there a second?
Second by Gonzalez.
Second by Gonzalez. Is there any other discussion? Seeing and hearing none, Jenna, could you call the roll, please?
Chambliss, Cummings,
Aye.
Ferguson,
Aye.
Fredson,
Aye.
Gonzalez,
Aye.
Sterner, Zarin, Barber.
Aye. And that minutes are approved. Next, we move on to our tab report. We have Mr. Dugan here tonight.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, everyone, members of the committee, of the Transportation Committee, the honorable members, I should say, General Manager Quaistra, Director Thompson, and of course, Jenna. And also, I see Chief Frizzell is here. How do you do, sir? I'll be listening forward to your report. You're welcome, sir. As I said before, Chief, you have many friends in the law enforcement community, and they regard you highly. Regarding MnDOT, the additional COVID funding is being reviewed for options for distribution because, unlike prior funding, these COVID-related funds will be available for operations, not just projects. The MPCA is in the midst of its Clean Cars rulemaking, which it began on December 21st with an announcement to do so. This week, today, and tomorrow from 3 until 6 p.m., an administrative law judge is taking public comments on the rule. And also the Governor's Climate Subcabinet will be meeting in March, hosted by MnDOT. The subject is clean fuel. Regarding the MAC, and again, I bring this up because council, honorable members, you may get questions on these kind of things from your constituents. Right now, and this is the member from the MAC emphasized this, at this time, the CDC is not requiring COVID testing on domestic flights. It still is and does require COVID testing for any passenger coming to the United States from a foreign country. Delta is resuming once weekly flights to Amsterdam, and why that's important is because Delta itself is opening a COVID testing facility at the end of Concourse G. So before one flies to Amsterdam or wherever it's expanded to, if the person tests negative, they can fly. If they test positive, they are taken to a secure facility and retested. If it's negative, they can fly. If positive, they go into quarantine. And it is recommended that anyone who's had a vaccine carry their vaccine card. Regarding domestic testing, aircraft passengers, the TSA announced that 4.03 million travelers flew over the President's weekend. That is nationally. And the CDC and TSA will continue to monitor it. And if it continues to increase, they may require domestic testing. And low-cost carriers, Sun Country and Allegiant, are expanding flights and aircraft. And before I go on, Madam Vice Chair, I apologize. I did not welcome you. I just see you now. Sorry about that. Tab business items on your March 8th meeting, you're going to have 2 streamlined tip amendments and then also a scope change. And just to refresh on scope change, it's when a project is applied for in the regional solicitation, that project description becomes the scope. And if there's any changes to that, it needs to be approved. The most simple being administrative, something very minor like adding benches and waste cans. Then it moves up to informal, which is something like an intersection, changing the traffic signal to a roundabout, or combining 2 tab projects. The most important, though, are the formal ones, where that goes under a full review, and that's such as changing the number of travel lanes, bridges, or an off-road bike path to an on-road. The other matter that came up from a policy end of things at the tab is a program year change. As I'm sure you know, the tab policy is there can only be 1 program year change per project and only allowed 1 time. There was an exception to be asked for in this. There will be future discussion in the tab about this. The sentiment is not to change, but to take each exception on its own. And this exception arose in the context of a project shifting from an environmental assessment to an environmental impact statement. This process is overseen by the EPA under a law called the National Environmental Policy Act. Just for your review, an environmental assessment is a short, concise review of the project and how it impacts the environment. There's no cumulative or geographic context to this. The result of this initial inquiry is either no significant impact, or it's called a FONSI, finding of no significant impact, or significant impact. If it is the latter, then it goes into an environmental impact statement, which is a comprehensive review, a hard look at the cumulative impact on the environment from the successive stages of the project, and also its impact on any and all area under development or reasonably foreseen to be under development. Examples of an environmental impact statement would be the Mall of America or rethinking I-94. And it is also triggered if the federal environmental law considers a series of individual projects connected. As of today, Ms. Schallberg will be going through the safety performance measure targets, which we did at TAB. And the next item on your agenda is the equity presentation, which was done at TAB by Roderick Southall, one of your colleagues at Met Council. And TAB will be addressing equity and transportation in each of its successive meetings. And lastly, for the TAB Executive Committee, elected as first vice chair is Hennepin County Commissioner Debbie Gattell from District 5, which includes Member Cummings, Richfield and Bloomington, and Member Ferguson's Eden Prairie. And the second vice chair is Mayor Mark Winchell of Chaska, who is in Barbara's district. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Peter. Are there any questions from council members? All right, seeing none. Thank you again very much. Next, we're on to reports. We have Metropolitan Transportation Services Director Thompson first.
Madam Chair and members, a couple updates this week. The 2021 Minnesota Transportation Conference is coming to a virtual conference on March 9th to March 11th. At this annual conference that started a few years ago, There will be speakers and sessions on a variety of transportation topics for all modes of transportation and for emerging transportation issues. MTS and Metro Transit staff will have presentations and studies that are presented at several sessions at this conference. And most of what we are presenting are items that have been before this committee. It's, of course, a virtual conference this year. There are opportunities as Transportation Committee members. You could register for single-day registration if you have time and are interested. There are a lot of interesting information about what transportation, not just among the council, but MnDOT, our local partners, and some good national speakers. So registration program information can be found at the University of Minnesota conference registration site, or you can reach out to Jenna and she can send you a link also. As a COVID update, we've only had good news, only one new COVID positive test since the last committee meeting. So trending very good in that location. We are, again, continuing to prepare for the vaccine. Last week, we sent all our private contractors and our suburban providers draft agreements that they will fall under so that their staffs can be vaccinated through the council's process that we're developing. The council is coordinating all the public transit worker vaccinations for the region, including our private contractors and suburban providers. And then finally, last week, we had over 10,000 healthcare essential worker trips on Metro Mobility, 10% growth just over the last time I reported to you, which is reinforcing the need that we had to start to implement fares for those essential workers starting on March 1st. So late last week, we started notifying those that are using the service for healthcare worker travel and their employers who have been really good at communicating the service out to their workforce. And today we started to notify the media through press releases and communications that have started to go out today. So we will continue to offer the service for healthcare workers for now, but they will start to pay a fare, which I think will affect the demand some, so that we want to make sure that we have capacity for our regular Metro Mobility customers who are itching to come back to the service if they haven't yet, and they're beginning to be vaccinated and expect them to come back. So with that, Madam Chair, that concludes my remarks. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Director Thompson. Councilmember Chambliss.
Yes. So I'm assuming that the benefit that the healthcare workers had, I'm having a hard time talking today, the healthcare workers had from in using Metro Mobility was kind of like an extra benefit. We had the extra capacity in terms of the availability of the buses. So there's no hardship as a result of them having to pay. Is that correct?
Yeah, Madam Chair, Councilmember, that's a great question. I'll start you back to when we started this service last summer. We had been cutting back a lot of the fixed route service. And so we felt that this was needed, especially the overnight service for those healthcare facilities served by light rail and others. The hours had been reduced in service. So this was a supplemental service that we added so that they could get to work. And a lot of those fixed route services have started to come back, are at a higher level than they were last August. And so, we also had the capacity. And so we wanted to make sure that capacity was used because there was a benefit to keeping our contracted work drivers employed in case when the Metro Mobility ridership came back. And so we're now just back at that transition phase where we need to we've really looked at it. We do think that most of these workers have a good fixed route option available to them now, today, whereas they maybe did not last August. And so we expect that some of them will transfer back to fixed route, which is also a lower transit fare on fixed route than it is on Metro Mobility. So there's some benefits for them to transfer back to fixed route.
Councilmember Chambliss.
Oh, go ahead, Molly.
Go ahead, Councilmember Cummings.
Thank you, Councilmember. Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to make the comment, really more than a question, that I think that this was a thoughtful and creative pivot in the middle of the pandemic that really offered a service that we could, and we could keep operators employed, and we could help those who are dependent on transportation and perhaps lost some or perhaps didn't. It just as, you know, as we all say over and over and over, we're all in this together. And I think this was really a good example of how we can provide a service that doesn't harm us, that helps me. And so I am to you, Nick, and to the rest of your team for coming up with this plan. And I understand the reasons, and it's appropriate, I think, to make the change now that things are changing again. So again, just my thanks for doing that. I think it was a very creative, thoughtful, and beneficial service to offer, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
We appreciate that, and I know our staff is actually really excited to work on it and design it. You know, feel that they're really contributing to the core workers during this pandemic has been very rewarding, both for our staffs and contractors, to be able to provide this service.
Good, thank you. Councilmember Chambliss, did you have another comment? You're on mute.
I'll wait until we get the GM report.
Okay. All right. Anything else for Dr. Thompson? All right. Seeing none, we'll move over to you, General Manager Koistra. You're on mute.
Well, after a stellar start, we'll go on with the COVID update. We've had a total of 369 employees now diagnosed with COVID from March 2020 through yesterday, and the figure includes 8 new cases since the committee met last on February 8th. Metro Transit bus and rail services are not experiencing service impacts due to COVID leave, and we're seeing a drop in cases like all other sectors have seen a drop in cases. With respect to vaccines, since the last Transportation Committee meeting, Metro Transit and Council leadership have met with vaccine planners from MDH and the 1B phase of allocations, about the 1B phase of allocations that includes public transit workers. As shared previously, our initial vaccine plan was submitted to MMB in January. The state has not yet announced the timing of phase 1B, but we do have a contractor and a site secured for distribution. So we will be able to quickly respond once those vaccines become available. Metro Transit has continued to search for and promote other opportunities for employees, including through the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Native American tribal communities. And finally, we have been promoting to employees the new online state vaccine connector for pre-registration and scheduling information. Since December 1, Metro Transit has made free on-site and take-home COVID tests available to our on-site essential employees at their work sites. To date, about 1,500 tests have been completed through this opportunity. We continue to recommend that on-site essential employees complete weekly COVID tests to help minimize spread. These tests have identified so far 6 asymptomatic and pre-symptomatic cases that may have led to unnecessary spread had they gone undetected. The partnership started with Health Partners for free employee testing at Drive Up, and Haywood Well Work Clinic is also ongoing and doing well. Secondly, the Metro Transit we're preparing to hire new bus operators for the first time in a year. This is going to be a small effort because, as you know, we started out with a bus operator shortage. We don't want to repeat that, and so we've had probably over 200 operators who've separated either because they've retired, they've transferred, or they have received promotions. So we're starting this out slowly, but we don't want to find ourselves in a situation again where we have an operator shortage. Next month, Adam Harrington will be providing the committee with a service update, and as part of this update, Brian Funk will also provide an operator staffing update, so you'll get more information on this. And then finally, I wanted to mention that Network Next BRT outcomes presentation is on Wednesday, February 24th at the Metropolitan Council meeting. BR staff will present an information item on Network Next BRT plan outcomes at this week's meeting, and the presentation includes recommendations on the next 3 arterial bus rapid transit lines. That includes F line along Central, G line, Rice and Robert, and H line, Como and Maryland. So you'll get the full presentation on that at the next council meeting. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Wes. Are there any questions from council members? All right, Councilmember Chambliss.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everyone for their updates. It's always good to have that information because we can't be in all the meetings. So that's really a premium and it's efficient way of getting information. I'm really excited about the BRT proposals that are happening through Network Next, and taking a look at the different paths as a result of Network Next, and also some of the options that we're looking at as we're doing the Blue Line extension planning for BRT as well. So it's very encouraging to see how we are planning way in advance for how we're going to have interconnectedness throughout the region with our light rail and our buses and serving the community. So kudos to everyone who saw that as a need and an importance and executing it.
Thank you. Any additional questions or comments from council members? All right, thank you, Wes. We can move on to our business items. We don't have anything on consent tonight, so our first business item is business item 2021-53, procurement of 143 biodiesel 60-foot transit buses. And we have Brian Funk here. Welcome.
Hello, Madam Chair. Are you able to hear me okay?
Yes, we are.
All right, thank you. So as stated, I am here today seeking that first the Transportation Committee and then the Metropolitan Council authorize the regional administrator to negotiate and execute a contract with New Flyer of America Incorporated to provide 143 base order biodiesel 60-foot transit buses with options for up to 29 additional replacement and expansion buses in an amount not to exceed $121,997,561. Metro Transit, as stated in the business item, is replacing and also expanding our fleet. And so these 143 base order buses over the next 3 years will be used to meet those fleet plan needs. In particular, these buses comprise the fleet for our Orange Line BRT service, the balance of the D line buses, B line buses, and our regular articulated bus commuter express replacements. The request for proposals was advertised October 28th of last year. There are 8 registered plan holders for this project. The proposals were received in December, and 1 proposal was received, and that was from New Flyer of America. The staff involved reviewed that. Procurement conducted an adequate competition determination to ensure that there was no indication the solicitation specs were restrictive and that there was adequate opportunity for competition. Office of Equal Opportunity did not set a DBE goal for this project because like the last business item for buses that I presented, it is federally funded and requires proposers to comply with an FTA DBE requirement for rolling stock. The evaluation panel that was assembled, evaluated, and used their knowledge and expertise from a variety of disciplines to make a recommendation, including quality, qualifications, experience, price, and then ability to meet our current and future needs. This proposal, as submitted by New Flyer of America, was highly ranked, provided a very fair and favorable price for the council of $747,897 per bus. When we compare this to a similarly equipped bus purchased on the 2014 contract, this price is about 1.6% higher, whereas the index for inflation over the last 7 years is closer to 15%. The award and execution of contracts for rolling stock does require council approval. We applied the Thrive lens for this project, like all procurements, and it does advance outcomes through regional livability, sustainability, and prosperity. Funding for the bus purchases will be approved by the council and into the authorized capital budget through amendments as funding is available and buses are procured off this contract. And I will say that there is no known opposition to this project, but I do want to address why we do not have electric buses as part of this procurement, just very briefly. This was raised at a prior business item when we had 40-foot buses, and it's a very legitimate question. And I just want to start off by saying that Metro Transit does remain committed to evaluating that technology. We're committed to looking for opportunities, and we're learning a lot from our C-Line pilot project that's been underway since June of 2019, and what that is teaching us about next steps. In this particular procurement, we do not believe that the battery electric buses that are currently available are the right fit. The orange line in particular does have a propulsion type specified in the grant agreement that would not allow for an electric bus propulsion. The D and B line routes, their profile was examined to determine whether or not they've made a good fit for electric buses with on-route charging. Because of the length and route scheduling that takes place, they're not a good application for this. And frankly, we are learning quite a bit about the BRT experience on the C-Line currently. And then our typical use of 60-foot buses is on more of the express commuter service. And so over the next several years, if we return to a more traditional service plan, that's likely where these buses would end up, which does not necessarily align exactly with our goals or what we need to learn about how to integrate electric buses into our operation, especially on our core urban local routes. And so I'm excited that we're going to be able to get to come back for an item that's already on the standing agenda to talk about our electric bus pilot program. It's at the end of March or early April. And to just reiterate that we are continuing to look for opportunities and explore examples. We are undertaking in concert with our facilities department the overall planning that's required to make a larger commitment and a bigger expansion of our bus fleet here at Metro Transit. We continue to work through the PUC and Excel Energy grant opportunities to look for opportunities to fund some 40-foot buses so we can gain that urban local experience. And finally, the FTA announced a 2021 low and no grant emission program that we're fully invested in creating an opportunity for and submitting an application to try to make that our next pilot project. So with that, I just wanted to make sure that everyone understood that this is something we do take seriously and are committed to, but do not feel that this would be the right procurement for that.
All right. Thank you, Brian. Are there any questions from council members? Councilmember Fredson.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Brian. Do we know if the buses are going to be made in Minnesota, either at the St. Cloud or Crookston plant, or we don't know that yet?
So I can't say that for sure, although our experience tells us that we'll have that ability to have them made here at the St. Cloud plant. So I can't commit until we start to issue our notice to proceed and go with the builds. But I fully expect that there'll be an opportunity for that.
Thank you.
All right. Any additional questions? Councilmember Chambliss.
Yeah,
We can't hear you.
you said there were 8 project plan holders for the project. I'm assuming those are, you meant people who might have been eligible to apply. Is that correct?
Madam Chair and Council Member, that's correct.
Okay. So for a normal purchase like this, I know since we've had biodiesel around for a while, do you normally get more than one vendor to come forward?
Madam Chair and Council Member, so right now in the transit bus market for the 60-foot articulated type of bus, there's really 2 primary players who may be likely to bid. And I believe that, I can correct this if I'm wrong, but when I was part of the evaluation panel for the 2014 procurement, I believe that we had 2 bidders and ultimately ended up going with New Flyer in that contract as well.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'll correct and say that the 8 plan holders are both the two bus manufacturers, but then also those who are subcomponent manufacturers that would be party to the procurement.
All right, thank you.
All right, any additional questions or comments? All right, seeing none, I'd entertain a motion to approve business item 2021-53.
Councilmember Cummings.
Oh,
has-
Councilmember Cummings.
Question, sorry. Mr. Funk, can you just explain a little bit about how the option to purchase additional buses would work? And so does that mean that the price that we are paying is guaranteed during this payment, during this contract period, regardless of when we would order additional buses if we choose to? Or how does that option work?
Right, Madam Chair and Councilmember Cummings. So the way that the contract is specified is that we're going to have a defined price for each year that those buses are exercised. And so that's something that does get negotiated into the contract. So we do have price certainty regardless of when those options are purchased.
And a follow-up, thank you, Madam Chair. And then are we obligated to purchase at those prices from New Flyer during this contract period?
Madam Chair and Councilmember Cummings, I know that Procurement Director Jacoby is on as well, but my understanding is that when we sign this contract, and if we were to exercise options under this contract, we would pay that agreed upon price, yes.
Okay, thank you.
All right, any additional questions, comments? I'll pause longer this time. All right, so seeing none, I'd entertain a motion to approve business item 2021-53.
It's Councilmember Fredson. I move approval.
Moved by Councilmember Fredson. Is there a second?
Second by Chambliss.
Seconded by Chambliss. Is there any other discussion? Before we proceed with the vote, I will note that Jody Jacoby did put in the chat box that there is no obligation to purchase the options. Okay. All right. So is there any other discussion? All right. Seeing and hearing none. Jenna, could you call the roll, please?
Chambliss? Chambliss?
Aye.
Cummings?
Aye.
Ferguson?
Aye.
Fredson?
Aye.
Gonzalez?
Aye.
Sterner? Zirin? Barber?
Aye. That the motion carries. Next round to business item 2021-54, a same week item. It's the 2021 Safety Performance Measure Targets, and we have Heidi Schalberg here to present.
Thank you, Madam Chair and committee members. I will also be co-presenting today with Jed Hansen, who has been our intern since the end of May last year. So he's been doing a great job working virtually this whole time. He's wrapping up his final year in the master's program in planning at the University of Minnesota and has done a lot of great work for us on the safety targets. So I will start the presentation and then hand it off to Jed. Next slide, please. So this is basically an annual business item that you may remember having seen in previous years, where as an MPO, we have federal requirements to adopt annual targets for 5 federally required safety performance measures. So we're required to track the number of traffic fatalities, the number of serious injuries, the rates for those two, and then the number of pedestrian and bicycle fatalities and serious injuries. Next slide, please. So this is something that we can either choose to set a number for the region, which is what we have typically done since this requirement started, or simply state that we support the state targets. One key difference for us as an MPO that differs from our friends at the state DOT is that state DOTs are reviewed by the Federal Highway Administration on an annual basis to assess if they're making significant progress in meeting their targets. And if they are not, they have some financial repercussions with using certain pots of federal transportation funds. So at the MPO level, we do not have that annual federal review. So aside from just the on-the-ground implications of how many people are killed and seriously injured, there's not additional review in whether or not we're meeting the targets. Next slide, please. This is just basically a timeline. MPOs have 180 days after the state DOTs set their targets. We met initially with a work group I'll talk a little bit about later in December to come up with a recommendation for the region. It's gone through our technical committees and TAB with their support. and the 180 days would be by the end of this week. So this is why it's going the same week to council on Wednesday with your support. Next slide, please. So there are kind of two primary ways of thinking about setting these targets. And in the past, we've basically just taken what MnDOT has used as a methodology and applied it to the region. By doing this in the past, that resulted one year in actually having an increase in the targets based on the changes in what was actually happening in the ground with increases in fatalities and serious injuries. When this was going through our technical committees, this was a concern to some of our local stakeholders about sending that message about setting an increase in targets. And so really kind of the other way of thinking about it is setting kind of a baseline, especially in our context as an MPO, where we can use it simply to kind of reflect on how we're actually doing on these numbers on an annual basis and use that information to make any needed changes that we might need to make in policies or investments to help us meet our longer term safety goals. Next slide, please. Did just want to briefly review, of course, our overall goal at the state level, which the region supports, is that we eventually have 0 people dying or seriously injured from traffic crashes. But in the intermediate term, we do have these annual targets, and did just kind of want to review that 2019 is the most current year of finalized crash data that we have. The state is still finalizing the 2020 numbers. These numbers do apply to the full MPO planning region, so it includes the 7-county region plus the urbanized portions of Wright and Sherburne counties in the MPO planning area. And if we just look at what our targets were for 2019 versus what actually happened, we did come under our targets, meet our targets for annual serious injuries, and then the pedestrian and bicycle fatalities and serious injuries. We did not meet the target for annual traffic fatalities, and then the 2 associated rates with those. I will say that from the preliminary 2020 numbers, just for the 7-county region, we are seeing that those numbers indicate for the annual traffic fatalities that we have 116 people who died in the region last year, which is a little bit higher than what our 2020 target was. So it's just to give you a snapshot of where we've been at with that. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned briefly, we did, as part of the recommendation last year, was to create kind of an ad hoc work group with some of our local stakeholders to help us identify what the best methodology would be for the region to set these targets, rather than just simply always following what MnDOT has done in the past. And so we did have a work group that met in December with some of our stakeholders from counties, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and then of course our partners at MnDOT that work on performance measure and safety related work. Jed did a lot of work reviewing for us what other MPOs were doing and how they handled this annual requirement. And so the work group reviewed potential methodologies and then ended up coming up with kind of a modified version of one of those for its recommendation, which is before you today. With that, I'll hand it over to Jed. Next slide, please.
Hello. So to provide some context, we'd like to overview how MnDOT has changed their methodology for determining the state targets. Their targets are now based on their strategic highway safety plan goals. So in that plan, the state had set a goal of no more than 225 traffic deaths and 980 serious injuries by 2025. They then set their state targets on a downward trend based on prior year performance towards this 2025 goal. To reach the goal, fatalities must decrease by about 23 per year. However, since this method is influenced by actual crash outcomes, if fatalities increase in a particular year, there's a chance that MnDOT's new methodology may result in targets that are greater than prior year. Next slide, please. After reviewing target setting options, the work group recommended using a 4th methodology developed through discussion. This method seeks to reach our region's share of MnDOT's strategic highway safety plan goals by 2025. This method sets the region's targets on a decline consistent with the statewide plan. It also ensures the targets do not increase from year to year, as the target is based on a goal rather than outcomes. Under this method, the target allows us to evaluate our performance towards reaching the plan goals. In 2021, this means holding over our targets from 2020, and in future years, it means reducing our targets annually by approximately 8 fatal injuries, 67 serious injuries, and 17 pedestrian and bicycle fatal and serious injuries. Next slide, please. This table illustrates the progress towards reaching that strategic highway safety plan goal. The council will still be asked to set targets annually. Based off the average performance from 2015 to 2019, staff calculated our region's share of the 2025 statewide goals, which are shown in the last row on that table there. The goal in 2025 would be 74 fatalities, 464 serious injuries, and 115 non-motorized fatalities and serious injuries. As you can see on the table, targets would decline each year to reach this goal. And the target that we are asking you to set today is shown on the top row there for 2021. And I will pass it back to Heidi.
Thanks, Jed. That concludes what we wanted to present to you today. We'd be happy to try to answer any questions you might have. Otherwise, we would be looking for your support in recommending adoption of these targets for 2021.
Very good. Thank you, Heidi and Jed. Any questions from council members? All right. Councilmember Fredson.
Thank you, Chair. I would just say I think we're approaching 400 deaths on our roads in transportation systems statewide, not just in the metro. So it seems like we actually have a smaller percentage of fatalities compared to the in the metro compared to the state. Just didn't know if you had any comments on that. And then the other question I had was, do we know how we compare to other sort of like metro regions as it relates to fatality rates?
Thank you, Madam Chair and Councilmember Fredson. You're correct that overall, just kind of from some of the preliminary data, that we saw that fatalities were up last year statewide overall. But when we were looking at the preliminary numbers, again, just for the 7-county region, which is just a little bit easier to get on that quicker basis at the county level, we were actually down a little bit last year, kind of in contrast to the statewide trend. I will say kind of when we look historically, kind of what our average tends to be, we tend to represent about 29 to 30% of all traffic fatalities. However, I will say that when you look at pedestrians and bicyclists, that's where the region really does have a higher share of those. So I think pedestrians, it's usually around about 45% of all of the state's traffic fatalities for pedestrians happen in the metro region, and about half for bicyclists happen in the region. So it is something that does look a little bit different once you break out those modes. And that was kind of part of the idea behind that federal requirement with including those two modes broken out separately. So I'd say as far as metros, I would say generally just there's kind of an annual report on pedestrians specifically that we tend to do better in comparison to other metro regions with that. And I would say overall Minnesota has done a lot of work on safety with the state DOT level and the partnership with DPS. But we also do kind of look at the numbers too, where we still have people who aren't making it home or have kind of life-altering injuries as well. So kind of that overall framing of understanding that until we get to 0, that's kind of an unacceptable number that we're at that we'd like to change.
Thank you. Are there additional questions or comments from council members? All right, seeing and hearing none, I'd entertain a motion to approve business item 2021-54, same week.
Motion to approve by Chambliss.
Moved by Chambliss. Is there a second?
Second by Gonzalez.
Seconded by Gonzalez. Is there any other discussion? Seeing and hearing none, Jenna, could you call the roll?
Chambliss,
Aye.
Cummings,
Aye.
Ferguson,
Aye.
Fredson,
Aye.
Gonzalez,
Aye.
Sterner, Zirin, Barber.
Aye. With that, the motion carries. Thank you, Heidi and Jed. So council members, that comes to the end of our business for the evening. I would recommend that both items move non-consent to the full council. The second one, because it's a same week item, but I think the dollar amount and the nature of the first one would be good to go in front of the whole council. So if you agree. Okay,
Mhm.
very good. Then we're going to move on to our information items. The first line is a Beeline draft corridor plan. We have Adam Smith and Katie Roth here to present.
Thank you, Chair. Hello, everyone. My name is Adam Smith. I'm a senior planner in the BRT Projects Office, and I'm pleased to be here this afternoon to provide an update on the Beeline. Go ahead and the next slide, please. So just an overview on the Beeline BRT. As many folks know, it's looking at the substantial replacement of Route 21, which has historically been the second highest ridership bus route in our system, but the slowest in-service speed. And even throughout the pandemic, ridership on Route 21 has remained relatively strong, really underscoring the importance of a lot of the trips that this route serves, along with the variety of trip types along this corridor. At this point, the project is fully funded and is targeting an opening in 2024. Just a reminder in terms of project goals for the Beeline, it's really looking at providing faster, more reliable transit trip times across the corridor, improving the transit experience both at the stop and on vehicles, expanding equitable access to destinations, and really providing efficient connections to both the existing and planned transit network in our region. Next slide. So in terms of the broader project schedule, initial corridor recommendations and station planning was really the focus of 2019 and 2020. So at this point today, with the release of the draft corridor plan, we are looking for public feedback on the platform level of detail for each of the stations. With the feedback, we will be looking to bring a recommended corridor plan to the council for a formal release for public comment in May, followed by to bring a final corridor plan to the council for approval in September. At that point, the project would really transition formally to the engineering phase, continue into 2022, with construction beginning the following year in 2023. Next slide, please. So just, as a sort of background in terms of the planning work that has been done to date, very early on in the planning for the process, we heard a lot of stakeholder interest, particularly in the city of St. Paul, about extending the project from what was then the eastern terminus at Snellingham University to Union Depot in downtown St. Paul. So in November 2019, we did release corridor recommendations for the project, which included this extension, along with a recommended alignment through the Midway area, and identified 33 preliminary station locations based on key factors like ridership, connecting transit service, station spacing, those sorts of things. So at that point, we did some engagement around those general locations. And I think that was something that was a lesson learned for this project from previous arterial BRT projects, was really bringing out these preliminary station locations. And now at this point where we are honing in on the platform level of detail. So which corners of each of these intersections should host a BRT Beeline platform. Next slide, please. So again, the key component of the corridor plan, of the draft plan, is really identifying those station locations and the locational platforms within each of the intersections. And the council's action through the planning phase is really setting those station locations in place at the platform level. So this planning process is the point where that decision is made. In addition to the platform locations, the draft plan also includes some additional context for the corridor, including a refined bus service plan that looks at the mix of different types of bus service within and along the Beeline corridor, as well as beginning to look at potential bus priority treatments to meet those speed and reliability goals for the project. Next slide. So as an example of this really core element of the draft plan, you can see sort of the proposed platform location. So again, after engaging around the intersection level of detail earlier on in the process, we've really been going through site by site with our agency partners to evaluate the more detailed options and review various considerations for platform location. So this includes things like bus operations, space constraints, adjacent land use, and then effects on access for pedestrians, bicyclists, effects on traffic, those sorts of considerations as well. Here's an example of at Lake Street and 36th Avenue. We can kind of see the existing location and configuration of bus stops versus what is being proposed in the draft plan for BRT platforms. Next slide. So as I mentioned, there's some additional information in this draft plan beyond those platform locations. Part of this is a refined bus service plan for not only the B-line service, but also local service along the corridor. So Route 21, we're looking to provide local service on Lake Street between Hennepin Avenue and Minnehaha Avenue, and then service between Selby Avenue and the Midway area is being proposed to be replaced by a new local bus, Route 60, which would provide that local service and that connection between Selby Avenue and directly to the Midway area. These conceptual service plans will continue to be refined as we move toward B-line implementation, and we'll also be evaluating Route 53 service as part of that process as well. Next slide. So as I mentioned, a key project goal for the B-line is really speed and reliability. We're looking to improve travel times by approximately 20% in this corridor. And if you think about sort of what the typical sources of delay are for Route 21 buses today, a lot of our standard arterial BRT improvements help reduce those sources of delay. So things like increasing stop spacing, placing stops efficiently, adding off-board fare payment and all-door boarding really can help reduce the amount of time that customers are entering and exiting the buses. But based on some of the preliminary analysis that we've done to date, it looks like further improvements will be necessary to really meet those project goals for speed and reliability. And so at this point in the process, we're starting to take a closer look at bus priority treatments. And again, this is a little bit of a new item or a new phase in the process compared to previous arterial BRT projects, where we're really looking at this, taking a close in-depth look at bus priority treatments with our agency partners during the planning phase. And that's really in recognition that this corridor has some particular speed and reliability challenges. So again, this is something that we have started to look at and will be continuing to look at as the planning and engineering phases continue. Next slide, please. So in terms of outreach and engagement strategies, of course, very much influenced by COVID restrictions, but we are looking to really prioritize the project website where we have materials that really serve sort of a boiled down information, key information and station concepts from the plan, as well as the plan document, an introductory video, giving folks a summary on how to, what the project is and how to comment, and then comment boxes really tailored for people who might want to give feedback on one or more specific stations along the corridor. And in terms of driving, commenters and members of the public to the website, we have a number of different tactics, including direct mailings to residents and businesses along the corridor, emails to subscribers, rider alerts, and some limited in-person feedback where we can at key bus stops. And again, I mentioned, this is not the first engagement work that we've done as part of this project. So really leveraging some of those previous relationships that we've built with community organizations and neighborhood groups to continue getting out the word on plans through those means. Also looking at putting up, we'll be putting up flyers around bus stops so that people can see that and access plan materials that way, and social media. Next slide, please. So just kind of coming back to what the next steps are, and again, taking an outlook of the future steps of the project. We'll be gathering feedback from the draft corridor plan at this stage, again, really looking to get that, that localized knowledge of each of these platform locations and things that we need to be considering. We'll be continuing to work with various agencies along the corridor to develop recommendations for best priority treatments. And then, we'll look to come with a recommended corridor plan in May and release that for public comment, which would lead toward a final corridor plan that we would present to the council for approval in September of this year, prior to entering the full engineering phase, and then followed by construction. Next slide, please. And at this point, we'll be happy to entertain questions.
All right, questions from council members.
One from Reba.
Councilmember Chambliss.
Yeah, so I'm looking at the bus service plan, and I'm seeing that some of the stops have like 8 to 10 blocks between them. And that the Route 21 is going to continue to run every 30 minutes for, I guess, a large portion of the route. What would happen if Route 21 went away? What is the advantage of having Route 21?
So in the portion, Chair, Council Member, in the portion of the corridor where we have proposed continued local service, it sort of varies based on where it is. So the Route 21 between Hennepin and Minnehaha on Lake Street, that's really the most intensive segment of the Lake Street corridor in terms of existing Route 21 ridership. And so part of it is an acknowledgement of how heavy ridership is within that segment, along with the fact that it is serving some neighborhoods that show the highest propensity to ride transit, and again throughout the pandemic. In terms of the proposed Route 60 in St. Paul, that has been proposed as a part of what we heard from that earlier engagement step in terms of the importance of retaining a direct connection between the Midway area and Selby Avenue. And that came about as a result of the proposed alignment for the B line, no longer crossing the interstate to serve Midway.
Okay, so I take it that the Route 21 would continue to be monitored based on usage and need. So then let's just say hypothetically, you keep 60 and eventually some years down the road, 21, the B-line service is going so good, 21 is going to be phased out. So a person would need to pretty much be able to walk 4 blocks to get to the closest stop, if it's 8 blocks between the stops, so just kind of looking at how far they would have to walk. And that seems reasonable. I mean, for people who are used to having buses stop at every block, at least that's the way it used to be. And you used to be able to run to catch the next one, but you don't have to do that when they're running every 10 minutes. Just thinking, are you looking at that? What does it mean?
Yeah, Chair, Council Member. So, on average, the spacing between stations is about 0.4 of a mile, which is in line with our BRT stop spacing. guidelines. So, we're looking at 2 to 3 stops per mile, and based on where Route 21 users board the bus today, it's 83% of current Route 21 riders would either be boarding the bus at the same location or within a block of the same location based on the stations that are proposed. So, we're really capturing a large majority of folks within a block from where they currently access the Route 21 today.
Okay, thank you.
And Katie, you might want to add on to this. I will just say I remember with the engagement we did with the Sea Line, it's just once you get out into the community, they really want to see that local route still maintained for at least moving around in their own communities. If you're out running errands or things like that. And I remember a lot of our public engagement, that was a topic that came up was, yes, we love the ABRTs, but we still want to have our local bus so we can get around in our community.
Yeah, Madam Chair and council members, I think that what we see in the service plan represented here for the B-Line is pretty consistent with what we've brought out for previous arterial BRT projects in the past, in that we've got the local underlay. I think one step that we've taken with this corridor is to even refine further where we're proposing that local service to serve the greatest need and do so in a way that we think is most sustainable in the long term. And so really targeting that stretch of Lake Street between Minnehaha and Hennepin, where ridership is highest and there's that greatest need for additional capacity. And we think the most demand for the mix of the two services, a space between Minnehaha and Snelling where we would not propose underlying service, and really focus on getting those stations in the right places to serve as many people as possible, but without that kind of underlying safety net. And then drawing that new connection to the Midway for folks on Selby Avenue. So I think what we're seeing here is what we believe is a good balance toward approaching both that question of having the mix of services that people want and will ride in the corridor, and doing so in a way that sets us up for long-term sustainable operations.
Sounds good.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Any other? Yeah, no problem. Councilmember Fredson.
Chair Adam and Katie, for all your work on this. Obviously, we're really excited to have the B-Line. 2024 can't come soon enough. If you could just go back to slide 7 really quickly. I just wanted to confirm the route for that, or proposed route for the new 60. So is it would buses in both directions on the combination of University, Snelling, Selby, and was it Marion?
Yeah, council member and chair. So this preliminary map for Route 60 does show
John Ireland. Yep.
Yes. So it shows a sort of connection to Capitol Rice Street Station on the Green Line in the east with a short loop in that area, and then using Marion to get back down to Selby, and then Hamlin to University, and then doing a similar thing with Pascal to St. Anthony to Snelling to University on the western end. But,
and can you sorry to interrupt, Chair.
Good.
Yeah. Can you explain what that? So I'm a little confused. You have the crossover at Hamlin, but does it circulate around, say, Allianz Field there? It appears.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
All right. Additional questions or comments? All right. Well, I just want to make a quick comment. And it was really like, if you took a look at that slide that was just up there, I think Councilmember Chambliss talked early on in our comments at the beginning of the meeting about how we're really trying to build a system that's connected. The B-Line connects things. B-Line connects to LRTs. It connects to several of our ABRTs. It connects to the Orange Line. I think that just sort of that vision and planning of kind of pulling this all together, I think really shows that we've been thoughtful in how we've done this. So thank you all for your hard work. It's much appreciated. Councilmember Fredson.
Yeah, Chair, one more comment, which is just, if you think about what the communities and the neighborhoods have been through over the course of last year, this investment is just so needed, and we look forward to it.
Very good. All right. Any last words from council members? All right. Thank you, Adam and Katie. Nice work. All right. Next, we are on to Metro Transit's role in emergency powers. We have Vince Pellegrin, Brian Funk, and Chief Frizzell joining us today.
Good afternoon, council members. My name is Vince Pellegrin. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at Metro Transit. Today, Brian Funk and Chief Frizzell and I are going to tag team a presentation for you, talk a little bit about our emergency preparedness at Metro Transit. This opening slide here, I just wanted to direct your attention. You can see the bus on, don't panic there. The bus, we actually put that bus on its side on purpose with a tow truck. This is what we call a full-scale exercise that was part of the full funding grant agreement from the Green Line. This picture was taken, this was actually on the university campus right there by TCF Bank Stadium. In May of 2014, just before the Green Line opening. You can see police, fire, EMS. We do a lot of this kind of emergency preparedness exercises with local first responders. In fact, the Federal Railroad Administration requires that we do on North Star a emergency preparedness exercise every other year. So this is something that we're pretty good at. We do these all the time, and we include bus and rail as part of our effort. Next slide, please. I would like to point out here, this is the National Response Framework. Now, you may have heard the term NIMS. This was actually put in place as a result of what happened during 9/11. The first Secretary of Homeland Security, Tom Ridge, determined that the first responders at 9/11 weren't really good at working together, and they decided this is a document actually done by FEMA now, and the National Response Framework is the standard that we use. This is how we organize ourselves. This is what we use this regularly now and have for several years. We use this to do our Super Bowl plan. We use this to do our Final Four plan. We do this with Vikings games, Twins games, State Fair. This is something that we do regularly. I was privileged right after 9/11 to be with a team of people that battalion chief from FDNY, a deputy commissioner of police for New York City, battalion chief from Los Angeles Fire Department. We went around the 30 different cities in the United States teaching this to transit agencies. Transit agencies are required to use the National Response Framework and the incident command system that it depicts. So just want to give you a little background on that. That's how we organize ourselves. Next slide, please. This is the State of Minnesota Emergency Operations Plan. And this is a Minnesota Emergency Operations Plan is a document derived from then Governor Palente's executive order. It consists of 22 state agencies that form a disaster emergency response organization. The Emergency Response Plan recognized the Metropolitan Council as a member of that response organization. And the intent of the plan is to present an all hazards approach to emergency preparedness by identifying the various roles each state agency can contribute during a response to disaster or emergency. Now this plan, by all hazards, I mean this plan covers tornadoes, floods, any disaster where the governor may declare a state of emergency. This plan kicks in and all state agencies contribute to the resources to respond to that emergency. This plan was it was passed by the Metropolitan Council in April of 2007. Then chair of the Met Council, Peter Bell, was the signatory. And what one of the things that the emergency response plan requires is each of those 22 agencies I pointed out earlier has a designated emergency manager that reports in every year activities to the Department of Public Safety. In April of 2008, Peter Bell appointed me to that position as emergency manager of the Metropolitan Council, and along with that, I hold a certification of emergency preparedness from the state of Minnesota. Since then, a number of transit police and other staff from light rail and from buses also have certifications in emergency management. Next slide, please. I apologize for the busyness of the slide, but I wanted to share this with you. This comes directly out of that framework plan that I showed you earlier. We've adapted it for our use, and this is the plan we put in place. This is how we organize ourselves early on in the pandemic. You can see on the left side there is the executive policy group and executive leaders. That's you all on the left side there. We report the incident commander, who right now is the of the pandemic is the regional administrator. And just to give you an idea of how the staff is there, we have a finance chief, a logistics chief, a very important position. That's the chief that gets us all the disinfectants and masks and all the stuff that we need to operate in an emergency response. Everything from those disinfectants to contracts for vaccination that that was talked about earlier. And then the planning chiefs also are involved in finding those vaccination sites and all those kinds of things, just to give you an idea of how our organization chart works and the sort of the division of labor there, and how we report that to you. Next slide, please. And I'll pass it on to Mr. Funk.
Hi, thank you, Vince, and good afternoon, council members. It's good to be back with you on a little bit different topic for this afternoon, but I hope to just give you confidence that Metro Transit has worked through a number of emergency response efforts and provided aid to the community over the years, starting, as Vince mentioned, with things like full-scale exercises. We also have tabletop exercises where we run through scenarios in-house and with other partners. Instead of going out in the field, we do our what-ifs to try to plan for all of the things that we can assume might happen. And even in between here, we also do familiarization exercises. Like, for example, with our electric bus pilot program, we ensured that local first responders had a good familiarization of that technology and equipment. So if they needed to respond, they were prepared to do so. Next slide, please. Up next is a picture of August 1st from 2007. I think everyone who was living here certainly remembers where we were that day. I know the chief was staring into that river, and those of us at Metro Transit were figuring out our resources and how we could respond to help the effort to recover. And so you can see on the bottom left, we have Metro Transit buses ready to go to be able to support that law enforcement and first responder response. And then in the upper right, we have staff in the State Emergency Operations Center, in this case, over off of Cedar in downtown St. Paul. Next slide, please. Fast forward a few years to another tragedy that most of us remember where we were, May of 2011. Minneapolis, the north side was hit by a tornado that cut right through the heart of the community. We, of course, were in full operations that day, and on the upper left, you can see from the time that it was safe to return into the area to provide that aid and help, we were there. The picture on the bottom is at Brookdale. Likewise, on the right is also at Brookdale for a volunteer cleanup effort. With these response type initiatives, it is a really good thing to have a lot of people who want to help, but it needs to stay organized. And so in this case, Metro Transit helped step up to provide that logistical and transportation support. So everyone looking to help was able to do so, but it was done in an orderly fashion to make sure everybody was safe and going to the right areas. Next slide, please. And finally, I'll give you a couple of recent examples. In the last 2 years, Metro Transit has responded to well over 100 different calls for assistance. And by and large, we're providing that sort of humanitarian support. About 75% have been related to structure fires, house fires, where either firefighters need a warming bus, residents who've been displaced need a place to recoup and assess before other organizations like the Red Cross are able to come in, and then we transport people to their temporary housing. We've provided support for a number of people who are experiencing homelessness, especially during the pandemic here, going between sites. This response covers the entire metropolitan area. More than 19 cities have received service from us over the last 2 years across virtually every county in the region. Next slide, please. A couple of memorable events as well that we're really proud of, that we're able to integrate with the community during times of need, include the Christmas Day Drake Hotel fire. Metro Transit buses were called on Christmas morning, and our staff, our supervisors, our operators, our mechanics were able to get over there and provide help at the scene, as shown in the picture on the left. But then it didn't stop there. The picture on the right are people's belongings. This is everything that people had as they were evacuating that building and trying to pull together the collection of their belongings. We ensured that buses were loaded up and that we had a good, safe, dry place to secure them until days later, people were able to be reunited with, in some cases, all of their personal possessions. Next slide, please. As Vince mentioned, we've organized ourselves to be able to respond to the COVID pandemic over this last year. Very early in the pandemic, because Metro Transit has established itself as a trusted partner, we were called upon by the state EOC to assist when 32 of our fellow Minnesotans returned from quarantine on the Grand Princess cruise ship in March. And despite all of the uncertainty early in a pandemic, unknown what's going on, and even the basics of how this virus was potentially being transmitted and spread, we had no problem with employees volunteering and saying, look, I'll do this, I'll feel comfortable, you give me a mask and some gloves, and I'm gonna help out the community. And so they met airplane on the tarmac and were able to get people home safely. Next slide. And one last recent example is just earlier this month during the depths of the cold and below zero nights, city of Minnetonka experienced a house fire and really needed a place to be able to rotate crews. You can see from this series of tweets that multiple departments were called in to respond because of the conditions that the firefighters were experiencing, and Metro Transit received a token of thanks for our provisions to provide buses out there. All right, and next slide. So now I'm going to transition into our role as an operational unit for supporting both the 2020 civil unrest as well as the upcoming trial preparations. As shown here, Metro Transit did play a role during the civil unrest following the killing of George Floyd. You can see that we provided both transportation to personnel, as well as in this case here, this is at our Martin J. Reuter garage in Brooklyn Center, provided housing and a nice place to rest for our National Guard troops. In fact, we were in a meeting the morning when things started to get really, really tough in the Twin Cities on our COVID response. It was a COVID command meeting. And because we were organized so well, and because Vince has taught all of us these tenants that we work with, we were able to transition from how are we responding to COVID to how are we responding to something that this region has never had to manage or deal with. And so very thankful for that. And it was just a testimony to the organization that we had in place to be able to make those command decisions, get variety of feedback, and then be able to move forward and communicate and execute a plan. Next slide. So moving forward with the upcoming trial, the chief is going to follow me and provide you more of a detailed timeline, but I'll just say that Really since the unrest in June started to settle, we've of course been managing through uncertain times, but we've been dedicated to take our lessons learned from May and June and be able to apply them forward and use the advantage of time to be able to plan so that we're able to maintain our service as best possible. This whole presentation has been about our incident command structure and organizing ourselves, and we'll continue to use that to our advantage moving forward so that we can keep everyone updated and safe. We are connected in, and the chief's going to talk about our role in Operation Safety Net. And then I just wanted to show a quick picture here of our Emergency Operations Center. And so Metro Transit internally for our operations also does organize itself. So when we have anything from major sporting events like the Super Bowl or Final Four to the potential for situations that need to be managed centrally, we have that facility available to us and it's ready to go at a moment's notice. Next slide. Okay, so moving forward into our preparations for the upcoming trial and deliberations and ultimate verdict. Metro Transit, our mission is to keep our employees and customers safe while maintaining transit operations whenever possible. And our plan, what we've been working on for months, is describing those most likely scenarios, as well as how we're going to communicate with our customers to ensure that people have the information both ahead of time, as well as when plans need to change. And so to illustrate that, we, the chief and our PIO have been participating in a number of press conferences. That's going to continue over the coming weeks. We're also encouraging all of our customers to seek information on our website, sign up for rider alerts. That'll be the fastest way in real time that we're able to communicate if any changes are needed. We know, as evidenced, I'll show you a couple pictures in just a moment here. We know that there are going to be a need for temporary detours around City Hall and the Government Center. And the planning has set out a mission to make sure that people are able to exercise their First Amendment rights. We're going to respect that, but we're going to also maintain operations. And so we have more than 100 detours that we can activate as needed. Now, it doesn't make sense to activate everything before it's needed, but we'll be ready to go and be using our partnerships to get those going as soon as they're necessary. Along those lines, of course, we have a major light rail station at Government Plaza. We're prepared through multiple approaches to be able to continue to serve the downtown area. And if necessary, we could turn around and stop at US Bank and provide bus replacement service whenever possible. And so we're really thinking through what are all of the possibilities, all of the uncertainties to develop those plans ahead of time. Our facilities divisions are also preparing for both our public and support facilities in the event it's needed, or if we need to make quick repairs or close things or open things based on our service levels. And finally, we're prepared to assist partners as part of, as Vince described, the MEOP. And so we are identified in there as one of the support functions. And as stated here, we are making commitments for transportation support and logistical support, but we are not using our equipment for any arrest or detainees, and all players involved are 100% clear on that. And then real quick, 2 picture slides, and then I'll turn it over to Chief Frizzell. Next slide, please. So this picture, if folks have not been downtown since sort of late last week, this picture, as noted here, is on 3rd Avenue and 5th Street. It shows multi-layer of fencing and jersey barriers. Our light rail tracks are embedded in the roadway there, just to the south of City Hall. And next slide. And finally, here's a picture out the train cab of what that same intersection looks like from a train operator perspective. So you can see it was thoughtfully planned. We're able to continue to maintain operations as long as we are able. And if not, like I said, we have those fallback plans and we'll do our best to provide replacement bus service as best we can. And so with that, I'll go next slide and turn it over to Chief Frizzell.
Good afternoon, everyone. Madam Chair, council members, Chief Frizzell. And I'll start off by simply saying I can't say enough. The skill and expertise that Brian and Vince bring to this endeavor. At this level of training and planning, it continues, and it's been going on for several months now. It should be illustrated that Metro Transit Police Department has been at the table. This has been deemed what's commonly referred to as a unified command. So you're going to have federal, state, and local individuals all gathering intelligence and operating in unison to make sure that we can mitigate any life or safety issues that could very well take place during these uncertain times. It should be mentioned that as we went through that earlier portion of the presentation, unfortunately, or whatever the correct word is there, I was at probably 93% of those. Arriving at the 35W bridge collapse 6 minutes after it went down, all the way to out on Christmas Day patrol and responding to the Drake. And so I know what right looks like. And the way Metro Transit, under the leadership of Vince and Brian, have responded appropriately and well over it. I just want to make sure they've got credit is due. It has been a very challenging year, to say the least. With a pandemic and global unrest, I haven't seen it in nearly 3 decades. The MTPD is in partnership with operations at the federal, state, and local levels. And again, it's now falling under a unified command, which means all law enforcement agencies throughout the region and state will be involved in the decision-making emanating not only from the governor's office down through the Department of Public Safety and certainly through key individuals within the Met Council. So we've all come together, and yet again, to mitigate as many of these life safety issues that may present themselves during this next several weeks. It should be mentioned, we're down to 14 days. We started the phase 1 planning approximately 9 months ago with everyone at the table doing after action reviews and looking at what we did or failed to do during the civil unrest that presented itself last May after the tragic death of Mr. Floyd. We went total reactive, and I think it played out on a global scale. So the leadership throughout the state determined that that should never happen again. And we started a planning preparations based on what we learned, good, bad, and the ugly, with the May into April of 2020 global unrest, to make sure that we can mitigate that as the best of our ability. Now we go into phase 2. The media may have played it where doomsday is March 8th, 2021. That is not the case. That is the trial start date, where they will be selecting jurors in regards to the actual trial itself. Intelligence indicates that's not going to be the problematic period. But we look back on history in the early 90s, particularly 1992 with the Rodney King riots, most of the social unrest took place during the actual verdict piece, which we anticipate, total guess, towards the end of the month. However, as we talk timeline, that could very well flow into the actual anniversary of the tragic death of Mr. Floyd and cause more unrest. Phase 4 is the demobilization and reduction and going back to some sense of normalcy. And I hope and pray that we can come to that conclusion without any loss of life and or major damage to property. Next slide, please. So the actual mission itself is to prevent large-scale violent civil disturbances, assaultive actions, property damages, looting, etc. But I want to make sure that everyone fully understands that being at the table at the very beginning, Metro Transit infrastructure is the emphasis for MTPD. We want to make sure operator safety, our riders, our routes, as well as all our rolling stock has the protection and security that it deserves through the Metro Transit Police Department. So as we became a part of the unified command, I've made it very clear that Metro Transit police officers will not fall under the jurisdiction of anyone else. And their number one priority will be operator safety, as well as our infrastructure and those that ride all our rolling stock throughout the region. So with that being said, our mission statement is consistent with that desire, and without question, that is how we will deploy our officers and resources, again, to protect our critical infrastructure. I should also mention that one of our key considerations is to preserve and protect the lawful First Amendment nonviolent protests and demonstrations. We cannot get that lost in some of the disturbances and assaultive behavior that took place back in May. The Constitution guarantees that, and the number one emphasis of the Unified Command and officers and National Guard that will be deployed is to protect that right. However, not allow it to deviate into an area that could cause the global unrest and destruction that we observed last May. Next slide, please. So our overall objectives as we started our planning considerations consistent with the National Incident Management System and some of the other configurations as spoke to earlier by Vince, we want to maintain that peace and safety in our regions and cities. Prevent all those disruptive acts that, again, will be on a global scale if it goes like it did last May. So we will have the eyes on the state of Minnesota, particularly the region, and how all our partners interacting will react in the case of civil unrest. However, we remain to preserve and protect the lawful First Amendment for nonviolent protest. Next slide. So with that being said, it should mention that as we came together yet again to mitigate as many life safety issues that may present themselves during this next series of weeks, this is not our first rodeo. We've moved on and implemented the lessons learned from last May. We are 14 days from jury selection. MTPD has been at the table since day one to ensure Met Council and Metro Transit infrastructure during the entire operational period remains safe and secure. Are there any questions of me?
Thank you all for the presentation and very much appreciated. So I'm just going to open up the floor to questions or comments from council members. Councilmember Cummings.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chief, or I'm not sure which of you. Thanks for this presentation. It's encouraging and it's not a surprise at how organized you are. My question is regarding the civil unrest last year. Did Metro Transit PD receive any reimbursement for the additional expenses that we incurred for the work that we did beyond what would have been normal?
Through the chair, Councilman Cummings, to my knowledge, we did not. However, I believe Mr. Kobe's on that could answer whether there were any fiscal transactions that took place due to this.
If there is, if the governor's pot of money that he is proposing for all kinds of emergencies is not passed, how do we fund this? Is there any expectation that the additional services that we provide will ever be reimbursed, or where do we stand on that?
Through the chair, Councilman Cummings, I would simply say that legislation is upfront about how they're going to finance that. You probably all noticed that at the beginning of the week. That did not successfully pass for that, but that's a little higher than my pay grade.
Councilmember Cummings.
Did we absorb the additional costs from the unrest last summer through just our regular budget?
And through the chair, Councilman Cummings, I'm not aware of us receiving any additional funding to defer any of the costs associated with our activities last May.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Councilmember Chambliss.
Well, looking at all those barriers, I was downtown recently and I saw that. I thought they were doing construction still at the city hall. I'm trying to figure out now, you're scaring me. Should I go to the gym? I've been going downtown twice a week to the gym, but it's good to know that if I do go down there, there's going to be protection and reinforcement. This is just, I mean, it's just the start of the trial. So we don't know how long the trial is going to last, I would gather, but we'll be there as long as it lasts.
Yes, through the chair, Councilmember Chambliss, I can say that we've planned, again, as a unified command, all the way through the rest of March. Operational periods will be commencing here in as little as 7 days. Those reinforcements around critical infrastructure are deliberately planned for, and then we will have to react to incoming intelligence if it goes dynamic. And again, based on history, and this is just based on history, a lot of times the civil arrest does not start to take place until the verdict phase, which could very well be 26th of March moving forward.
Thank you. Any additional comments, Councilmember Fredson?
Thank you, Chair, and Brian and Vince and Chief for your presentation. Obviously, very thoughtful, and for you to rule out, say, like arrest buses, I feel like is striking the right balance between sort of using all the tools in our toolbox to assist the state and the communities in terms of dealing with unrest. Can you remind me? So I have two questions. Well, I guess the funding question is answered. So it's. Can you remind me or say what our policies are around the use of like combination of rubber bullets, tear gas, and flash bombs in the event that our officers were in the position that that kind of activity was necessary on some, or I guess not necessary, but you know what I'm saying. So what is our policy on that?
And I do. Thank you for the question. Through the chair, Councilmember Fredson, our policy is simply that we do not possess the capabilities to distribute rubber bullets or any of those other less than lethal type of things. However, we are training for the worst case scenario, what's commonly referred to as a CART team that could deliver smoke from a defensive type of a position. We've had some intelligence that if we get into, I won't get into tactics, but if we get into a situation where you need to screen a move or cover any type of a retrograde from an area, then smoke would be deployed, and we would have that capability. But before they deploy any of those, that would come from me and me only as the chief law enforcement officer.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? I just want to Brian, Vince, Chief, thank you all. And thank you for bringing us up to date, and thank you for your planning. It's and it's sometimes hard to take a look back and try and figure out what we could have done better, but I know you guys do that all the time. And so thank you for taking the time, and thank you for updating us on it. So much appreciated.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you all. All right, we've got one more agenda item. So this is the 2020 year-end ridership report. So we have John Harper and Eric Lind who are here today. I see Eric's on camera, so to me, you're presenting.
Yep. Madam Chair, this is John Harper. I will start the presentation this afternoon. So good afternoon, everybody, Chair and committee members. I am John Harper. I am the Manager of Contracted Transit Service in MTS. And with me, as you mentioned, is Eric Lind. He is the Manager of Analytics and Research at Metro Transit. We're going to present to you the 2020 year-end ridership report. It is not nearly as exciting as emergency response, but we'll give you some big picture info. 2020 overall, both at the council level and regional summary. And we will then dive in a little bit into COVID comparisons, 2020 to 2019. So next slide, please. I will start by setting the stage here, doing some big picture numbers for you. And this slide shows the blue line that across the top is 2019 ridership month to month. and the green line that drops down in April is 2020 ridership. And this just graphically shows the impact that COVID had on our ridership in this region. And you can see that ridership dropped from roughly 7 million rides a month down to about 2 million rides a month. So you can just see that here. This is for the council ridership as a whole. So next slide, please. This slide shows the breakdown of those rides by mode of service and mode and type of service. And you can see that the red bars in these two both are the local ridership, and those across the period of time have been the workhorse. The local rides is where our primary ridership is. The blue bar towards the top of each, the second largest segment is light rail ridership. And between the two of those, that's roughly more than 3/4 of our ridership as a system. And that was true in 2019 and continued through 2020 as well. Next slide, please. This shows those bars in numbers. This shows 2019 total ridership and 2020. It shows then the change in ridership and then the percent change. And none of this should be a surprise to any of us that have been talking about ridership across the last year or so. North Star ridership is down 80%. The other services are down, as you can see here, about 50%. And I want to emphasize here that this is the year in total. So the impact of COVID didn't happen until about April 1st. And so what you're seeing here is the first half of the year, the first quarter of the year, we were actually ahead of 2019 pace in 2020, and then COVID hit and dropped. And so a year as a whole, you can see this percent change. In most of our services was about 50%, and with the rail ridership, because it is only commuter type service, you can see that that reduction was a little bit higher. So next slide, please. This next slide then breaks down the bus ridership into its, that mode into its service types. And you can see here that the express ridership took the greatest hit across the year. The local ridership and the BRT numbers aren't down nearly as much. And Eric will talk a little bit later about BRT. That number needs to be taken with a grain of salt, this 24% reduction, because we added the C line mid 2019. So 2020 includes a full year of C line where 2019 does not. So Eric will break that down a little bit further later on. So next slide, please. What we've looked at so far is Met Council ridership. This slide then takes all the other regional providers and adds them to the mix. And this is still a year as a whole. And so you can see the reductions there that everyone else in the region as well took a hit. And you can see that their reductions here are greater than the Met Council's overall, primarily because these suburban providers in the U of M, well, the suburban providers are commuter services. And so they took a, when downtown shut down, they really lost almost all of their demand. The U, of course, when the on-campus class is shut down, the U reduction is seen there. So next slide, please. This slide shows the impact specifically of COVID. So what we did is we took September and October of 2019 and compared it to September and October of 2020. And we used 2 months just to make sure we had the same number of weekdays in our sample. But this is all, September and October of 2020 is all within the COVID timeframe. And you can see here that the reductions are significant. And the theme is the same, just the numbers are much greater. I'll say again that the suburban providers, because their primary reason for being is express service into downtown, you can see those reductions there are in the 80 and 90% range. MBTA has some local service that has retained ridership. That's why their number is not quite as high as the others. And then Met Council, with a 65% drop in the COVID period, is not as severe as the others because of the local service. All right, next slide, please. I will talk about this slide, the demand response change. We're getting down into more of the details now. As I say, I'll talk about this slide, then I'll hand the rest of the presentation over to Eric to talk about the Metro Transit or the more fixed route side of things. So this slide shows demand response change. And April was the time period when we had the COVID impact. Within our transit link ridership and our Metro Mobility ridership, we had a significant decrease, as you see here, down 80%. Metro Mobility ridership here reflects certified riders only, just to emphasize that. You know, the rehabilitation and training centers shut down. People were not taking discretionary trips. Those kinds of things were going on, and we saw that reduction. We took that capacity in our demand services and looked for ways that we could help that were not in our traditional service delivery. And the graph at the bottom, the table at the bottom shows that we took that capacity and we replaced our normal demand with food delivery and delivery of healthcare workers on our service. And so we probably half our ridership in the last months of the year have been food delivery and healthcare workers. And so that has been a significant impact to our community. You know, I'll say the healthcare workers, what we did is as we were reducing our fixed route footprint and we were socially distancing, we offered healthcare workers the ability to ride Metro Mobility to their hospital or their healthcare location. It was not just doctors and nurses, but it was really anyone working at those locations. And you can see the impact there in the quantities. So the rest of the presentation, I'll turn over to Eric to talk in detail about the rest of our services and then take questions. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Madam Chair and council members, nice to be with you. I think the year ago when we did this report, John and I, is sort of like the last normal thing I remember doing, honestly, right before that middle of March cliff came along. Next slide, please. So what I want to do is kind of build on what John was just talking about and actually emphasize a little bit of the good news instead of, you know, having to digest so many large negative percentages. We can talk a little bit more about who we've provided mobility to, the way people are using the system right now, and what we can learn from that as we build back. So the first thing I want to emphasize is the difference across the different fixed route systems in terms of the ridership change. And the dashed line you see there is BRT. The blue line below that is the local bus system. The green line is actually representative of light rail. And then there's two kind of a faint gray, and then that darker blue is a commuter rail and commuter express service. So what you're seeing here is something we've talked about before, which is that the BRT and the core local service has held up relatively well, at least better than other types of service during COVID. And that BRT is a little bit inflated up until June, because in June 2019 is when the C line opened. And the C line itself has been one of the most, if not the most robust route that we have running during COVID. So that shows us there is still very high demand, a relative high demand for these core local services. Next slide, please. So this is one really striking thing that we've observed, and this has been noted by other systems as well around the country. But what this is trying to show is how boardings change by time of day. And what you can see in that dashed line for Metro Transit is what you would have seen in, say, fall 2019, pre-COVID, which is as the hours of day go by, you see these very distinct peaks in the morning and afternoon that correspond to, of course, the 9 to 5 office commute. And no surprise with that particular trip type disappearing, our shape is a little bit different. But I think it's really interesting and important to understand that it wasn't that the peaks just sort of shrank and we had sort of a faint echo of that pattern. We have a totally different pattern, and it's a pattern that looks like what you would see on a Saturday pre-COVID, which is a sort of steady accumulation of trip making through the day with a peak in the mid to late afternoon and then a decline into the evening. And this is indicative of a certain type of trip making, which is more all-purpose, more covering multiple destinations, rather than, of course, the from and to the job centers of the downtowns. So there's still a lot of work commutes that are going on in this pattern. It's just work commutes to a 2 p.m. grocery store shift or to even a 6 a.m. hospital start. So there's different trip making that's sort of implied by this time of day pattern. Next slide, please. And then finally, just to share with you, a spatial version of the same thing. Who is riding is largely can be understood by where trips are being made. You see a great influence as you look at this map of our high frequency network. You see what will be the D line on what is currently the Route 5. You see what will be the B line along Lake Street. These services, again, just to emphasize that as we plan for upgrades to those, transit ways, we're talking about places that are still using transit very heavily, even during COVID. And of course, the downtowns, both St. Paul and Minneapolis, remain a focus of activity on transit, and that is partially because, of course, they're still big activity centers, even during COVID, but also because a lot of our service is oriented that way. So there's a lot of transferring that's still happening in the downtowns and through riding that's happening as well. So next slide. Just to summarize, I want to emphasize that obviously COVID's a challenge, but we've had some successes. We're bringing people, 85,000 trips a day right now. People going to essential jobs, they're going to get their necessities, groceries, pharmacy, whatever it might be. As John highlighted, but also the fixed route system is doing, we're providing support for healthcare workers who have been supporting the rest of society right now. And we've really been working very hard to match our service to demand that's going on so that we could travel safely with people on board, both in terms of the customers and our operators especially, providing social distancing in order, basically increasing our frequency to allow for enough capacity for people to social distance. We continue to see this relative strength of the local service and the arterial BRT network, which just gives us confidence when we see, the presentation earlier about the B line that's coming on, that we know that will be a successful service because we have a very robust demand, still within the COVID scenario, but still very robust. Next slide, please. So, obviously COVID-19 is a challenge for all transportation providers and transit systems around the country. In addition to the obvious about the trip making disappearing, we have had these capacity limits that we've had to deal with, which does have impacts on ridership as well. And, looking forward, there's a lot of theories out there, but really it comes down to the pace of vaccinations that's probably going to determine our recovery in terms of ridership. But I'm sure when you hear about the service plan, as was hinted at earlier, that Adam Harrington will be bringing, you'll understand that we've been thinking through this very carefully and understanding what I've been presenting here to build that service plan. Finally, there is a big question mark out there about the role of telecommuting into the future, and specifically what happens when you replace this very transit mainstay trip of a 9 to 5 office commute with no trip at all. That does pose a challenge to our organization of how we provide service, but I think it's a challenge that we're understanding more and more, and again have the understanding of what we've been observing during COVID to build from, and hopefully we'll have a robust ridership report for you a year from now. thanks for your time. I'm sure we'd be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Eric and John. Questions from council members?
This is Councilmember Chambliss.
Councilmember Chambliss?
Have we surveyed the express riders to find out, what their needs are going forward? As we get closer to having people vaccinated, we can expect the ridership to go up, but maybe not 100% because of the changes in the way that people are working. Is that something that you're thinking about doing at some point or at certain points, doing surveys?
Madam Chair and council members, yes, we have been doing lots of different types of surveys. This includes the Met Council sponsored travel behavior inventory, where they're looking at travel patterns during COVID, but also our marketing group has been surveying both previous commute customers based on our ability to contact them through their MetroPass program, and also employers around the region to understand what their plans are. And those are definitely figuring into how we're trying to reconfigure service.
Okay, that sounds good because obviously since that's the lowest and most consistent drop in ridership, and it's quite possibly with people moving to flex schedules, some people may decide that they want to jump in the car because it's not as congested. So we should probably be thinking about that, and maybe even I'm looking at Chris and thinking of the environment, maybe finding some incentives for them to not so easily jump into that car.
Yes, Madam Chair and council members, I'll just add that you put your finger on one challenge that will be there for us for a while, I think, which is the commuter express market. When we do survey them, a lot of times one of the strongest motivations they have for using transit to commute is parking and traffic hassles. And those are likely to be a little bit easier to deal with as there's not the same number of people each day going to downtown. And so it may be that transit is a bit of a lagging indicator in some of this, but it's definitely something that we're factoring in as we go forward.
Madam Chair, I just wanted to add in response to Councilmember Chambliss's suggestion on incentives. These are the kind of things that we're looking at right now as we think about marketing when we're in the post-pandemic period. And I really appreciate your thoughts on that, and want to assure you that those are the kind of conversations we're having right now when we talk about how to get how to regain ridership and market to regain ridership. Of course, if people are staying home, that's a good thing, both in terms of congestion and in terms of the environment. If in those situations people are using cars at different times, that's not good. And so we're really thinking about that hard. We're putting plans together to come back better and stronger, and that's all part of that thinking. So thank you for raising that.
Yeah, and I was just thinking that, maybe there's corporations that can support those incentives as well, corporations that are environment friendly. So, I would take this time to be creative in figuring out, what we can do with these changing times.
All right, any additional questions or comments? All right, not seeing any, so thank you, John and Eric, much appreciated. The data will help us as we move forward to make some good decisions, so much appreciated.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Absolutely. All right, and we are right at 6 o'clock, so I don't know how that happened, but we'll take it, right? So if nobody has anything else, all right, if seeing none, we are adjourned. Have a good evening.